The horse was not supposed to be dying on the side of a Kentucky road in the middle of August. But there he was, collapsed on the gravel shoulder like something the earth had finally given up on. His dark coat drenched in a sweat that had long since stopped cooling him, his nostrils flaring in short, desperate bursts that sent tiny puffs of dust rising from the ground beneath his muzzle. A chain-link lead snapped somewhere along the trailer hitch. No handler, no water, just the heat, the silence, and a creature too proud to cry out. Clara Vance slowed her truck to a crawl. She had been driving that stretch of Route 9 for 31 years, and in all those years, she had never once stopped for anything that was not her own. She stopped now. There is a moment in every person's life when the universe places something broken directly in their path and waits, very quietly, to see what they will do. Clara Vance had spent 3 years running from every moment like that one. She had sold the land, packed the memory, and chosen the silence of small rooms over the vast, punishing openness of the field. But August in Kentucky does not negotiate, and a dying horse on a gravel road does not ask permission to matter. If you have ever loved something you could not hold on to, stay with this story. And if you believe that some connections do not end, they only wait, leave a comment with the city you are watching from, because this one was made for you. The summer Clara Vance turned 58, she drove the same 8 miles between her rented house on the edge of Harlan County and the town of Callaway 3 times a week, always before noon, always alone. She drove a 1994 Ford F-250 that her late husband Eli had bought secondhand and kept running through a combination of mechanical skill and stubborn affection, and she drove it the way she did most things in those years, carefully, efficiently, and without expectation. The truck needed distilled water for its radiator. That was the whole purpose of the trip. She had 2 5-gallon jugs in the truck bed, still sealed, purchased at the hardware store on the main strip in Callaway, where a boy named Decker, who could not have been older than 22, always smiled too wide and handed her the receipt before she asked for it. She appreciated that about Decker. He understood that people who have lived alone for 3 years have already made their decisions before they walk through the door. The road home ran alongside the eastern perimeter of 3 adjacent horse farms, the kind of properties that did not advertise themselves with signs because they did not need to. The fencing was white-painted wood, freshly maintained, and it stretched for miles in both directions like the border of a country that had decided very early on who was allowed inside. The grass beyond the fence was the deep, confident green of places that had never known drought, fed by underground irrigation systems that ran on timers nobody ever had to reset. Clara had grown up on the other side of that fence. Not those fences, exactly, but the same idea of fence, the kind that exists not to keep animals in, but to remind everyone else where they stand. Her husband, Eli, had been a farrier, one of the best in 3 counties, and everyone who knew horses knew his name. He had shod animals on both sides of every fence in Harlan County, moving between the humble working farms and the grand estates with the same quiet competence he brought to everything. And people respected him for it without ever quite admitting that what they respected most was the fact that he never seemed to need their respect at all. They had owned 40 acres together, a modest spread by local standards, but enough. Enough for a small herd, a breeding program, a life built on the specific pride of people who work with their hands and their knowledge and ask nothing from the ground except the right to be honest with it. Eli died on a Tuesday afternoon in late October 3 years ago, a cardiac event in the barn while he was reshoeing a client's mare. Clara found him when she went to call him for dinner. The mare was still standing in the crossed eyes, patient as a prayer, her new shoes gleaming. Clara sold the ranch 14 months later. She told people it was because of the finances. And that was partly true. Without Eli's income and with the property taxes what they were, the math did not work. But the deeper truth was one she had never said out loud to anyone. She could not walk into that barn without feeling like an imposter in her own life. Every corner of those 40 acres had been shaped by Eli's hands and Eli's vision and Eli's particular way of moving through the world, and she was left standing in it like a woman who had wandered into someone else's painting and could not find the edge of the frame to step back out. The buyers were a young couple from Lexington. They had plans for a boutique wellness retreat. Clara drove away without looking in the rearview mirror. She had been renting a small house on Depot Street in Callaway ever since. 2 bedrooms she did not need, a kitchen that faced east, a porch she sat on in the early mornings when the light was still deciding what color it wanted to be. Her neighbors were polite and incurious, which suited her. She had her pension from the county extension office where she had worked for 19 years. She had her truck and her routine and the careful maintenance of a life that did not ask too much of her. She had also, without quite deciding to, been dying slowly in the way that people die when they stop letting anything new reach them. That was the woman who turned off Route 9 and pulled up beside the dying horse. The road was empty in both directions. Not unusual for that stretch on a Wednesday morning. The nearest house was half a mile back, tucked behind a stand of white oak that blocked the sound of everything except the wind and the occasional distant engine. The heat was the dense, pressing kind that August in Kentucky delivers without apology, the kind that makes the air itself feel weighted, like breathing through flannel. Clara put the truck in park. She sat for a moment with her hands still on the wheel, studying the animal through the windshield. He was lying on his right side, facing away from the road, which meant he had fallen in the direction of the ditch and managed to roll only slightly. His legs were extended. His breathing, visible in the rise and fall of his ribcage, was too fast and too shallow. The leather halter on his head was worn and poorly fitted. The cheek strap had rubbed a raw patch just below his left eye. The lead rope was frayed at the clip end, a clean break suggesting the metal had fatigued and given out rather than been deliberately cut. She got out of the truck. The gravel crunched under her boots and the heat hit her immediately, that solid August wall that made her squint. She walked slowly toward the horse, keeping a wide arc, approaching from the front where he could see her coming. She had been doing that her whole life, announcing herself to animals before she got close, giving them the courtesy of preparation. Eli had taught her that in the first year of their marriage, standing in a field with a 2-year-old filly who had never trusted human hands. Always let them see you first, Clara. They're not afraid of you. They're afraid of the surprise of you. The horse heard her footsteps and his left ear rotated toward her, but he did not try to rise. That was not a good sign. A horse that chooses not to rise when a stranger approaches is a horse that has stopped trusting its own legs. She crouched down about 6 feet away, putting herself below his eye level, and looked at him. He was massive, even collapsed. 16.5 hands at minimum, she guessed, with the deep chest and the long, powerful neck of a working stallion. His coat was a dark bay, nearly black in the shade, with a warmth that appeared only where the sun caught the edges of his haunches. His mane was matted and poorly maintained, and there was dried foam caked along his neck and shoulders from exertion that had happened hours before she arrived. But his eye, when it found her, was alert, still burning. That was the detail that kept her crouched there on the gravel shoulder of Route 9 when every sensible instinct she had was pointing toward the truck. As I said, I am still here. I am still worth saving. I am still something. Clara stood up and walked back to the truck. She looked at the 2 sealed jugs of distilled water in the truck bed for a long moment. She had bought them specifically for the radiator. The truck's cooling system was fragile and temperamental and had already overheated twice in the past month. Using this water meant a trip back to Callaway. It meant the possibility of breaking down on this same road in this same heat. She picked up the first jug. She did not have a bucket. She had, in the truck cab, a road map she had not opened in years, a pair of work gloves, 3 gas receipts, a tire pressure gauge, half a roll of paper towels, and her hat. The hat was a wide-brimmed straw hat that she had bought at the county fair 11 years ago, back when she and Eli still went to the fair every August without discussion, as if it were a law of the season rather than a choice. It was the kind of hat that women in Kentucky buy once and keep forever, the brim seasoned dark with sweat at the edges, the crown shaped by time and repeated use into something that had stopped looking like a product and started looking like a belonging. She took the hat off her head and carried it to the horse. She set the jug on the ground about 4 feet from his muzzle and uncapped it with a twist and a hiss of released pressure. Then she tilted it carefully into the upturned hat, watching the water pool in the woven straw, knowing she had maybe 30 seconds before it began to seep through. She moved the hat toward his muzzle. He smelled it before he saw it. She watched his nostrils widen, the small muscles along his jaw flickering with the effort of recognition. Then his lips reached forward, tentative and slow, and made contact with the rim of the hat. He drank, not frantically, not the desperate gulping of an animal that has forgotten all caution. He drank with a kind of focused care that broke something open in Clara's chest, because it was the drinking of a creature that had been thirsty for a long time and had simply accepted the thirst as a permanent condition and was now, very carefully, very slowly, allowing itself to believe in the possibility of relief. She refilled the hat 4 times from the first jug. Between refills, she talked to him. Not elaborate sentences. Not the kind of talking that needs an audience. She said things like "it is all right," which was not entirely true, and "I have got you," which was a larger promise than she had any right to make, and "stay with me," which was the thing she had most wanted to say to someone for 3 years and had not. His breathing began to slow. Not back to normal. Nothing about his condition was normal, but the desperate rapidity of it eased slightly. The way a person's breathing eases when the panic lifts just enough to remember that lungs are designed for more than emergencies. Clara went back to the truck and got the second jug. She was sweating through her shirt by now, the fabric plastered to her back and shoulders, and her knees ached from crouching on the gravel. She was 58 years old, and she had spent the last 3 years deliberately avoiding physical exertion beyond what her small life required. And her body was making sure she understood the cost of that. She did not stop. She went back and she soaked the paper towels from the truck cab and ran them along his neck and his shoulders, pressing the moisture into the hot, damp coat, trying to bring his core temperature down even incrementally. She checked his gums with her thumb, dry, grayish, not good, but not the color of a horse that was already gone. She checked the halter buckle and loosened it 2 notches to stop the rubbing on his cheek. She spent 40 minutes out there on the gravel shoulder of Route 9 in the August heat, using both her jugs of distilled water and her hat, and her paper towels and her voice, attending to a horse that did not belong to her, on a road that nobody was watching. The only sound was the distant sawing of cicadas and the occasional passing of a truck on the county road 2 miles west, too far away to matter. When the second jug was empty, she sat back on her heels and looked at him. His ear was tracking her again. Both ears, actually. That alert, triangulated attention that horses use when they are processing something important. His eye had changed quality somehow. Earlier it had been burning with the hard, concentrated light of pure survival. Now there was something else in it. Something she recognized without being able to name. She had seen that look before. In the barn on the 40 acres. In the stall of the animal that Eli always called the good ones. The ones that understood that a hand extended in care was not the same as a hand extended in demand. She was reaching for the empty first jug to use it as a stand when she heard the truck. It came from the north end of Route 9, a large diesel with the heavy clatter of a commercial horse trailer behind it, moving too fast for the road conditions. It slowed as it approached, and Clara stood up and turned, and the truck ground to a stop about 30 feet away. 2 men got out. The driver was a heavy-set man in his 40s named Burl. She would learn his name later from the patch on his work shirt. He had the look of someone who had been angry for so long it had become structural, like it had grown into the bone. The other man was younger, thinner, and said nothing. Burl looked at Clara, then at the horse, then back at Clara. "What in the hell?" he said. She told him she had found the horse collapsed on the road. She told him she had given it water. Burl said it was none of her business, that the trailer hitch coupling had failed and they had driven to get a repair kit, and that the horse was a commercial asset and she had no right interfering with commercial property. Clara said the horse had been in acute heat distress and she had done what was necessary. Burl took a step toward the horse, and then the horse stood up. It happened with a speed and a decisiveness that seemed to contradict every physical signal he had been giving for the past 40 minutes. He got his front legs under him, then his rear, and he came up in one long, fluid motion like something unfolding that had been folded for too long. He stood. He shook his neck once, clearing something from his mane, and he turned his head and found Clara. And he walked to her, not toward the trailer, not toward Burl, who was the person holding the replacement lead rope. He walked directly to Clara and lowered his head until his muzzle was 6 inches from her shoulder, and he stood there with the weight of his attention entirely focused on her in a way that made Burl stop moving. Burl said, "Get away from him. He is not a gentle horse." Clara did not move. The horse did not move. What happened next was the thing that would stay with Clara Vance for the rest of her life. The thing that would split her existence into a before and an after as cleanly as the cardiac event in the barn had done 3 years ago. The horse made a sound. Not a neigh, not a whinny, not the standard vocabulary of horse communication. He made a sound that was structured, intentional, rhythmic, 3 short snorts followed by a low, rolling exhale, then two clicks from somewhere deep in his throat that were not quite equine sounds at all. Three short, one low roll, two clicks. Clara's hand went to her mouth. She knew that sound. She knew it the way she knew the smell of the barn in winter and the feel of the old fence rail and the exact weight of the silence that filled the house after Eli stopped breathing. She knew it because she had heard it thousands of times in the 26 years she had spent beside the man who invented it. A training call, a signature, a communication pattern that Eli Vance had developed over 2 decades of working with difficult horses, a rhythm he used to signal safety to animals that had never been given a reason to feel it. No two trainers in the world used exactly that pattern. Eli had built it himself, slowly, over years, refining the intervals and the specific combination of vocalizations until he had something that was entirely his own. He had used it on every horse they bred and trained on the 40 acres. Every horse, including, she now remembered with a sensation like cold water filling her chest, the last foal born on their property. A dark bay colt, born 2 months before Eli's diagnosis. Born in a night storm in the 3rd week of August, Eli kneeling in the straw while lightning split the sky outside the barn. She had stood in the doorway with a flashlight and watched her husband bring that animal into the world with his hands and his voice and that exact rhythm, 3-1-2, over and over, until the foal found its legs. They had sold the colt with the ranch. Clara looked at the horse in front of her, the size of him, the color, the age of him if you did the arithmetic. The worn halter that fit badly over a head shaped like a horse that had grown considerably since the last person bothered to fit him properly. She said, "What is your name?" She was not asking the horse. She was asking the universe. But it was Burl who answered, with the indifferent economy of a man reading from a shipping manifest. Lot 7. Acquired through a dispersal sale 14 months ago. Part of a package. A dispersal sale. 14 months ago. She had sold the ranch 14 months ago. The horse pressed his muzzle against her shoulder and breathed out. Slow, warm, certain. Burl wanted to lead the horse to the trailer. He moved with the practiced efficiency of a man who had moved difficult animals hundreds of times, attaching the new lead with a quick clip and a tug to establish control. He said, "Come on," and he pulled. The horse did not move. Burl pulled harder. The horse planted all 4 feet in the gravel and lowered his head and became, in that moment, approximately the most immovable object in Harlan County. Burl said a word Clara did not repeat to anyone afterward. He pulled again. The horse remained stationary in the way that only large prey animals can be stationary, not with passive resistance, but with a kind of absolute conviction, as if movement had simply ceased to be a concept that applied to him. The younger man with the trailer tried approaching from the left flank. The horse's response was a slow quarter turn that placed his body between that man and Clara. Not aggressive, not panicked, just deliberate. And then he went still again. Burl looked at Clara and said, "What did you do to him?" "I gave him water," she said. He said, "He needs to get back in that trailer." Clara said nothing. The horse stood with his shoulder touching her arm. The silence between them, all of them, the woman and the 2 men and the horse, stretched for a long moment filled only with cicadas and the distant complaint of a crow somewhere in the white oaks along the fence line. Then a car appeared on Route 9. It was a black Mercedes, moving slowly and deliberately in the way that expensive cars move on rural roads, the driver's side window down. The car stopped behind Burl's truck. The door opened. The man who stepped out was in his early 60s, silver-haired, wearing pressed khakis and a collared shirt despite the heat. He moved with the bone-deep confidence of someone who had never in his adult life arrived anywhere and not been the most important person there. Thomas Sterling. Clara had not spoken to Sterling directly in 11 years. Not since the property dispute about the eastern fence line that had been resolved eventually, quietly, and not entirely in her and Eli's favor. She knew who he was the way everyone in Harlan County knew who Sterling was. Not through friendship, but through the particular cultural osmosis of living near power long enough to absorb its shape. He had 400 acres east of Route 9. He raised performance horses for the competitive jumping circuit and occasionally for resale to international buyers. He had 3 full-time veterinary staff, a team of European-trained riders, and a reputation for extracting maximum value from every animal that passed through his operation. He also had, Clara noted, the kind of eyes that assessed everything they landed on for what it was worth. He looked at the horse for a moment. Then he looked at Clara. He said, "Is that lot 7? Burl said, "Yes, sir. We had a coupling failure on the trailer. Came back to find this woman giving it water." Sterling studied the horse, who was still standing against Clara's arm, still planted, still watching Sterling with an attention that was not threatening but was intensely focused. Sterling said, "He is supposed to load on command." Burl said, "He is not loading for us." Sterling took 3 steps toward the horse. He extended one hand, palm up, in the practiced gesture of a man who knows horses and knows that he knows them. He said, quietly, "Come on, son." The horse looked at Sterling's hand. Then he turned his head back toward the road. Sterling's jaw tightened. He stood there for a moment with his hand extended and his expression performing a calm that his eyes were not quite committed to. And then he let his hand drop. He turned to Clara. He said, "What did you do?" She said, "I gave him water." Sterling looked at her, really looked at her, for the first time, in the assessing way he looked at everything. She saw the moment he recognized her, the faint shift behind his eyes that came with retrieving a file. He said, "You are Clara Vance, Eli Vance's wife." "Widow," she said. He acknowledged that with a slight nod. Then he looked at the horse again. He said, "This animal is a commercial asset registered to my operation. He is being transported to my breeding facility in Nashville. Whatever connection you think you have with him does not constitute a legal relationship." Clara said, "I am aware of that." Sterling said, "Then I would ask you to step away and let my men do their job." Clara looked at the horse. The horse was looking at her. She stepped away. The horse stepped with her. Sterling watched this. Something changed in his face, not softened, not moved in any sympathetic sense, but recalibrated, like a man who had encountered a variable he had not included in his calculation and was now determining what it was worth. He said, "I will make you a proposition." Burl and the younger man stood near the trailer with the carefully neutral expressions of employees watching their employer do something they did not understand. Sterling walked to the front of his car and leaned against the hood in a way that communicated both relaxation and authority, the posture of a man who has been told his whole life that he is good at this. He said, "The horse clearly has an unusual response to your presence. I am a practical man. I do not fully understand it, and I do not require understanding to recognize a situation. Here is what I propose." He paused, making sure she was listening. He said, "My facility is 5 miles north on this road. If you can walk that horse to my gate, without a lead, without restraints, just by your presence, I will sign a custody agreement transferring him to you for a symbolic fee. $1. You pay for his veterinary intake and he is yours." Burl made a small sound that might have been the beginning of an objection. Sterling silenced it with a look. Clara said, "And if I cannot?" Sterling said, "Then I will have no choice but to report this incident as an interference with commercial property. That carries civil liability." He said it pleasantly. That was the detail. He said it with the mild, even tone of a man who considers lawsuits a reasonable weather condition rather than a threat. Clara looked at the road north, 5 miles on a gravel shoulder in August heat. She was 58 years old with a repaired left knee and a truck that now had no coolant water. The horse was still recovering from dehydration. She had no way to make him follow her because she had no lead and no guarantee that the connection between them, whatever it was, would hold past the gate of this property. And at the end of those 5 miles was the Sterling operation, which meant walking past every farm and every neighbor and every person in this county who had watched her sell the ranch and retreat from her own life, who believed. She knew they believed it. That Clara Vance had let her husband's legacy dissolve into a real estate transaction. She said, "How long do I have?" Sterling said, "The afternoon." Clara looked at the horse one more time. He was standing loose now, not pressed against her but close, his head at an angle that put her in his peripheral vision, that specific orientation horses use when they are monitoring something they do not want to lose track of. She said, "I will need my hat back." She retrieved it from the ground where it had been sitting since the last refill, waterlogged and misshapen, and she put it on her head. Then she turned north and began to walk. She had walked about a quarter mile before she heard him behind her. Not the clip of hooves on pavement. The shoulder was gravel and packed earth, but the particular sound of large weight moving with intention, the soft compression and release of ground that large animals make when they choose to move. She did not turn around. She kept walking. The sound drew even with her left shoulder, and she felt him before she saw him. The warmth of his body at close range, the way large animals alter the air around them, a displacement that is physical and also something harder to name. She looked left. He was walking beside her. Not behind her, not leading. Beside her, matching her pace with the steady, unhurried gait of an animal that has decided where it is going. She said, "All right then." They walked. The first half-mile was empty road. Just the fence lines and the heat and the distant shapes of horses in a paddock to the east, standing in shade, watching. Clara kept her pace slow and even, saving what she had in her legs for the long stretch ahead. She talked, not continuously. She had never been a continuous talker, but in the unhurried way she had used in the 40 minutes before he stood up. Sentence or two. Silence. Sentence or two. She talked about the road. She talked about the heat. She said, "I have not walked this route in a long time. It looks different from this side." The horse's ears swiveled toward her voice and swiveled back. The second half-mile brought the first houses. Two properties set back from the road, belonging to families she had known for years. The Patton place, where Roger Patton had been Eli's first farrier client. The Marsh farm, where she and Eli had gone for every Thanksgiving for 12 years until Eli was gone and the invitations became gentle and then less frequent and then stopped. She did not look at those houses as she passed them. She looked at the road. It was Roger Patton who came out first. He was in his early 70s, moving across his yard with a retiree's measured purposefulness. And he stopped at his fence and stood there in the shade of his oak tree and watched Clara Vance walk past on Route 9 with a dark bay stallion walking freely at her shoulder. She heard him say, "Lord Almighty." She did not respond. She kept walking. The word traveled faster than she did, because that was how it worked in small rural communities, not through phones or social media, at least not primarily, but through the ancient telephone of neighbor telling neighbor, front porch to front porch. By the time she reached the 2-mile mark, she was aware of a small and growing collection of watching faces along the fence lines and at the ends of driveways. Some of them she knew. Some of them were strangers who had heard the sound of something unusual and come out to look. The horse remained at her shoulder through all of it. Through the section of road where a red truck slowed to look and the driver leaned out his window with his mouth open. Through the stretch where a pack of dogs at the Henderson place rushed the fence snarling and the horse did not break stride, merely turned his head toward them once with a look of vast equine contempt, and then turned back to the road. Through the moment, she had been expecting it, dreading it, when she passed the gravel lane that turned off Route 9 toward the parcel where her 40 acres used to be. She looked down that lane. The new owners had put in a decorative sign at the entrance. She could see the edge of it from the road. She could not read it from this distance. She looked for 3 seconds, maybe 4. Then she looked at the road ahead and kept walking. The horse, who had been watching her face for those 3 or 4 seconds with that specific rotated attention, made a soft sound through his nostrils, not the 3-1-2 rhythm, just a breath, like an acknowledgement, and turned back to face north. At the 3-mile mark, a local reporter named Pete Howell was waiting at the side of the road with a phone extended, because Pete Howell had received 3 separate calls in the past hour from people telling him something remarkable was happening on Route 9, and Pete Howell had learned in 20 years of small-town reporting that 3 calls about the same thing meant you drove there. He took photographs. He asked Clara if she would comment. She said, "I am just walking." He said, "Ma'am, you are walking a stallion without a lead on Route 9 in August." She said, "Yes." He said, "Is it true this horse belonged to the Vance operation before the dispersal?" Clara stopped walking. She turned and looked at Pete Howell with an expression he would later describe, in the article, as the most complicated face he had ever attempted to photograph. She said, "I do not know yet." Then she turned back to the road and kept walking. The 4th mile was the hard one. It was not the hardest physically, though her knee had been aching for the past mile and a half with a deep, rhythmic persistence that she recognized as the beginning of real damage. It was hard because of what the 4th mile contained. The 4th mile ran along the northern boundary of the Sterling property. Directly adjacent to the road, behind the white fence, was a large paddock where several of Sterling's horses were turned out during the cooler hours of morning, hours that had long since passed. But 2 of them were still there, standing in the far corner with the incurious patience of horses that live very comfortable lives. But that was not what made the 4th mile hard. What made it hard was the small group of people who had gathered on the road shoulder about 300 yards ahead, 6 or 7 individuals, some of whom she recognized immediately. Sandra Kern, who had been president of the County Breeders Association for 8 years and who had once told Clara, at a meeting Clara had attended 6 months before selling the ranch, that some people were simply not built for this life after they lose the anchor of it. Sandra had said it kindly, with the comfortable authority of a woman who has never questioned her own right to assess other people's resilience. Russell Tate was there, who had bought 2 horses from Eli back when the Vance operation was running, and who had not called after the funeral, and who nodded at Clara in the street when they passed each other as if the years of knowing each other had been reduced to nothing more than a social courtesy. And Margaret Voss, who had been Eli's oldest friend in the county and who had, for reasons Clara had never fully understood, taken the sale of the ranch as a personal affront, a failure of character that had calcified their friendship into something formal and cold. They were not blocking the road. They were standing at the side of it, watching. Sandra Kern had her arms crossed. Margaret Voss had her hands in the pockets of her jeans, her expression doing that careful thing it did when she was trying not to show what she was feeling. Clara slowed as she approached. The horse matched her pace. She could feel his presence at her shoulder, not a burden, exactly, but a weight. The weight of witness. The weight of a living thing that had chosen to be beside her and was not going to stop unless she stopped. Sandra Kern said, "Clara." Clara said, "Sandra." A beat of silence. Sandra said, "What are you doing?" It was not an entirely unkind question. It was the question of someone who genuinely did not know, and who found the not knowing unsettling in a way that had tipped toward disapproval. Clara said, "I am fulfilling an agreement." Sandra looked at the horse. She said, "That animal is Sterling's property." Clara said, "We have an arrangement." Russell Tate said, not to Clara, in the low murmur of a side conversation, "Sterling made that deal knowing she could not do it." He did not say it quietly enough. Clara heard it. The horse's ear rotated in the direction of Tate's voice, as if he had heard it too. She stopped walking. She stood in the August heat with her waterlogged straw hat and her aching knee and her empty water jugs in the truck back on Route 9, and she felt, for a moment, the specific weight of being seen by people who had already decided what they were seeing. She was familiar with that weight. She had been carrying it for 3 years. She had sold the ranch and become the woman who sold the ranch, and the distinction between those two things, between a decision and an identity, was one that nobody in this county seemed interested in making. She thought about what Sandra Kern had said at the meeting. Some people are simply not built for this life after they lose the anchor of it. She thought about the colt born in the lightning storm, Eli kneeling in the straw with his hands and his voice and his 3-1-2 rhythm. She thought about the way the horse had made that sound on the gravel shoulder of Route 9 and the way it had gone through her chest like a key turning. She thought, "If I stop here, I will never start again." Margaret Voss said, from the side of the road, in a voice that was careful and quiet, "The horse is looking at you, Clara." Clara looked left. The horse was watching her with that particular focused attention, both ears forward, waiting. She said, "I know." Margaret said, "Eli always said the good ones wait for you to make up your mind." There it was. 3 years of careful, studied distance. And Margaret Voss was standing on the side of Route 9, saying Eli's name into the air between them. Clara did not let herself feel it fully. She stored it somewhere she would be able to reach later, when there was time and privacy and enough stillness to open it carefully. She said, "That is true." And she turned back to the road and began to walk again. She passed Sandra Kern at a distance of about 4 feet. She did not look at her. She heard Sandra make a sound that might have been the beginning of another sentence. But if it was not finished. She heard Margaret Voss say, behind her, quietly, "Lord, look at that horse go." She heard the Sterling operation before she saw it. The sounds came first, the specific acoustic signature of a large, well-funded equestrian facility. The metallic ring of gates, the distant percussion of hooves on packed earth in a covered arena, the sound of a leaf blower somewhere, the mechanical hum of the automated watering systems. And underneath all of it, the contained, professional silence that expensive places maintain by design. Then the gate appeared. It was white-painted iron, set in a brick pillar on either side, and it was open because Sterling was already there. He had parked his Mercedes on the apron just inside the gate and was standing beside it, flanked by 2 men in the olive-green shirts of his stable staff. There was also a woman with a veterinary bag, which meant he had called ahead, which meant some part of him had believed she might actually arrive. Behind Sterling, in the distance, she could see the main barn, enormous, well-maintained, the kind of facility that had its own web page and a contact form for international inquiries. Clara stopped at the gate. The horse stopped beside her. Her left knee was a sustained electrical complaint by now, and there was a rawness on her left heel where the boot had rubbed that she had been suppressing from her attention for the last 2 miles. Her shirt was entirely saturated. She was not sure when she had last been this tired. Sterling looked at her, then at the horse. He said, "I did not expect you to make it." She said, "I know." He said, "The agreement stands. My attorney has a 1-page custody transfer prepared. The fee is $1. You pay veterinary intake for the animal. After that, he is yours." He said it with a kind of controlled neutrality, the tone of a man executing a contract he had not expected to be binding. There was no warmth in it and no hostility. There was, perhaps, something that might in a different light have been called respect, though Sterling was not the kind of man who used that word easily. Clara reached into her shirt pocket, where she had put a dollar bill that morning before leaving the house. Not because she had anticipated this moment, but because she always kept a bill in that pocket, the way Eli always had. A small superstition from his father's generation about the luck of a pocket that was never entirely empty. She held it out. Sterling took it. He said, "The vet will want to examine him before we finalize." Clara said, "Of course." The veterinarian, a compact woman in her 40s named Dr. Renata Marsh, no relation to the Marsh farm, she had grown up in Frankfurt, moved toward the horse with the careful efficiency of her profession. The horse allowed her examination without drama, standing still while she checked his temperature and his pulse and his gum color and ran her scanner along his neck for the chip. The chip. Clara had forgotten about the chip. Dr. Marsh scanned. She waited. She looked at the reading on the scanner. She scanned again. She said, "Huh?" Sterling said, "What?" Dr. Marsh said, "This animal is registered, fully registered. He is not Lot 7 from a dispersal. He has a complete pedigree." Sterling said, "That cannot be right. He was acquired in a package from an estate sale." Dr. Marsh read from the scanner screen. She said, "He is registered as Zephyr's Echo. Damn, Callaway Sundancer. Sire." She paused. She looked at Clara. She said, "Sire is Eli's Braveheart." Clara's hand stopped moving. Eli's Braveheart had been the centerpiece of the Vance breeding program, a stallion that Eli had acquired young and spent a decade developing, not for the competitive circuit, which he had never cared about, but for the specific combination of temperament and athleticism that he believed made a horse capable of genuine partnership with a human being. 3 of Eli's Braveheart's progeny had gone on to work in equine-assisted therapy programs. 2 had been used for search and rescue training. The bloodline was considered extinct after Eli's death because Eli's Braveheart had been gelded after a health complication in his last year, and his last foal had been sold with the ranch before anyone thought to check whether the breeding records had been preserved. Dr. Marsh said, "This horse carries the last documented line of Eli's Braveheart. There is no other living example of this pedigree." She looked at Sterling. She looked at Clara. She said, "He is worth considerably more than any arrangement accounted for." The silence that followed Dr. Marsh's statement was the kind of silence that has a temperature. Sterling's face did not move. He was exceptionally good at faces that did not move. But something behind his eyes shifted. That rapid, involuntary recalculation that even the most disciplined people cannot entirely conceal when the numbers change. Clara felt it. She had been standing close enough to powerful men her whole life. Landowners, bank managers, the kind of men who sat on opposite sides of tables and made decisions about things they did not love, to know what that shift looked like. She said nothing. Sterling said, "The agreement was for $1." Clara said, "Yes." He said, "That agreement was made under the assumption of a different material reality." There it was. He said, "I was not aware of the pedigree. The animal was acquired as undocumented stock. Had I known the registered lineage, I would not have made that arrangement." Clara said, "But you did make it." Sterling said, "Under a material misrepresentation of the facts." She said, "I was not the one who misrepresented anything. I did not know about the chip either." Sterling looked at his attorney, a thin man in a gray shirt who had appeared from somewhere during the veterinary examination. The attorney said something quietly, and Sterling's expression did not change. Sterling said, "I think we should all take a moment." What happened next was not something Clara had planned or anticipated. It happened because of Pete Howell. Pete Howell, the reporter, had followed Clara on Route 9 at a respectful distance, far enough not to interfere, close enough to photograph. He had been standing outside the Sterling gate during the veterinary examination, shooting through the bars, and he had heard enough of Dr. Marsh's announcement to understand that the story he thought he was covering had just become a different and considerably larger story. He posted the first photograph at 3:47 p.m. He posted the second at 3:52. By 4:15 p.m., while Sterling was still consulting quietly with his attorney on the apron of the Sterling Gate, Pete Howell's photographs had been shared 1,400 times through regional horse community networks and 2 national equine enthusiast groups. The photographs showed a 58-year-old woman in a waterlogged straw hat, standing at the gate of Sterling Farm with a dark bay stallion at her shoulder and her hand extended toward a silver-haired man in pressed khakis. The caption Pete Howell had written was, "Widow walks dying stallion 5 miles to claim her husband's legacy." Sterling trying to back out of deal. He had, as it turned out, excellent instincts for a caption. The next morning, Zephyr's Echo refused to eat. This was not immediately visible to anyone outside the Sterling operation, but by mid-morning the stable manager had called Dr. Marsh, who had called Sterling, who had, by this point, spent 14 hours attempting to navigate an increasingly public and increasingly hostile conversation about the value of a verbal agreement and the character of a man who would back out of one. The horse was lying down in his stall. He was not in distress the way he had been on the road. His vitals were stable, his hydration was adequate, his temperature was normal. He simply lay on the straw with his chin extended and his eyes open and declined to acknowledge the offerings of feed and the presence of the staff and the careful professional efforts of 2 of Sterling's most experienced handlers. Sterling's head rider, a Danish man named Gjeld who had 20 years of international experience and 3 Olympic-level horses in his resume, spent 2 hours with Zephyr's Echo and came out of the stall and said, "There is nothing wrong with this horse that I can address." Sterling said, "What does that mean?" Gjeld said, "It means the problem is not medical and it is not training. The horse has decided something and I do not know how to undecide it for him." By the time Clara arrived at the Sterling Gate at 9:30 a.m., having been called by Dr. Marsh, who had called her with a careful professional neutrality that somehow communicated quite a lot, a small crowd had gathered outside. The people who had lined Route 9 the day before. Pete Howell with his phone, Sandra Kern, whose arms were no longer crossed, Margaret Voss, who had brought coffee in a thermos and offered Clara a cup at the gate without saying anything. Clara took the coffee. She walked through the gate and down the long gravel drive to the main barn, and she walked into the barn, and she found the stall. She said, from outside the stall door, "I am here." Zephyr's Echo raised his head. She said, "Come on, then." He stood up. He walked to the stall door and pressed his muzzle against the latch, and Clara unlatched it. And he walked out into the barn aisle and stood at her left shoulder the way he had stood at her shoulder on Route 9. Sterling was watching from the far end of the barn. Clara turned and looked at him. She said, "I believe we had an agreement." Sterling stood very still for a moment. He was a man who had spent his entire adult life winning, and the particular quality of this loss, the kind that happens in front of witnesses and that a photograph already exists of, was something he had not fully prepared for. He said, "My attorney will have the paperwork ready by noon." The paperwork was ready at noon. The custody transfer was a single page, as promised. The fee was $1, already paid. Clara signed. Sterling signed. Dr. Marsh witnessed. The document was photographed by Pete Howell before the ink was dry. And then, at 2 p.m., Sterling's attorney filed a motion in Harlan County Circuit Court challenging the agreement on the grounds of material misrepresentation, specifically that the discovery of Zephyr's Echo's pedigree constituted a change in material facts that invalidated the agreement. Clara found out from a voice message from a county official she had not spoken to in 2 years. She sat on the porch of her rented house on Depot Street with the phone in her hand, and the coffee Margaret Voss had given her still warm in a cup she had not finished, and she let the information settle. Sterling had the resources to litigate this indefinitely. She had her pension and the $1,400 she had left in her emergency account after the veterinary intake payment, which had been $380. She had no legal representation. She had, as of 12 hours ago, a horse she could not yet stable. She had a signed custody document that might or might not survive a legal challenge from a man with a team of attorneys. She sat with this for a while. Then she called Margaret Voss, because Margaret Voss had been Eli's oldest friend and had worked for a small civil advocacy organization in Callaway for 9 years before retiring. And because the way Margaret had said Lord, Look at that horse go on Route 9 the day before had been the voice of a woman returning from somewhere distant. Margaret picked up on the second ring. Clara said, Sterling is filing a legal challenge. Margaret said, I know. It is already on Pete Howell's feed. Clara said, I do not have the resources to. Margaret said, I know a lawyer in Frankfurt who will take this on principle. He does not charge for cases he considers to be offensive to basic decency. I believe this qualifies. A silence. Clara said, Why are you helping me? Margaret said, Because I stopped helping you 3 years ago when you needed it, and I am not going to let that stand anymore. Another silence, longer. Clara said, I will need a place to stable the horse. Margaret said, Roger Patton already called me. He has 2 empty stalls, and he said Eli always used his barn in emergencies, and he sees no reason to change that policy. Clara did not say anything for a moment. She said, All right. Margaret said, Get some sleep, Clara. Tomorrow is going to be full. The legal challenge lasted 9 days. It did not last longer because of 3 things that happened in sequence. The attorney from Frankfurt, whose name was David Reese and who had the wiry, compressed energy of a man who had been angry about injustice for 30 years and had found a productive use for the anger, filed a response that was, by Pete Howell's admittedly non-legal assessment, devastatingly thorough. The second thing was that 2 of the largest national equine heritage organizations, after seeing Pete Howell's photographs and reading his follow-up article about Zephyr's Echo's pedigree and its significance, issued public statements expressing concern about the disposition of what they described as an irreplaceable genetic legacy. The third thing was Sterling's board of directors. Sterling Farms LLC had 4 outside investors. 3 of them sent the same message through 3 different channels, within 72 hours of the story breaking nationally. The reputational damage from the public perception of a wealthy horse operation attempting to claw back a verbal agreement from a widow who had walked 5 miles in August heat was not something they were prepared to absorb. Sterling dropped the challenge on a Thursday afternoon. David Reese called Clara to tell her. She was in Roger Patton's barn, brushing Zephyr's Echo, which she had been doing every morning for the past week with a brush she had found in a box of Eli's equipment that Margaret Voss had kept in her storage room for 3 years, having retrieved it from the ranch before the new owners arrived. She kept brushing when the call came. She held the phone against her shoulder and listened and said, Thank you, David. And then she put the phone away and kept working. Zephyr's Echo turned his head and watched her with that particular focused attention. She said, You are staying. His ear moved forward. She said, We are both staying. She had made arrangements with Roger Patton for long-term stabling. She had begun the process, with David Reese's help and with input from Dr. Marsh, of determining what a responsible future for Zephyr's Echo looked like. There were equine therapy programs that had been wanting to re-establish a line like his for 15 years. There were breeding inquiries already arriving through the heritage organizations. There were options that she had not had 3 weeks ago, growing from the ground like something that had been waiting for the right conditions. She was not yet sure what shape her future took. She was 58 years old, and she had been away from the field for 3 years, and she did not have the 40 acres, and she did not have Eli. She had a horse in Roger Patton's barn and a dollar bill that was now in David Reese's possession as Exhibit A, and a straw hat that had held water for a dying animal on the side of Route 9 in August. She had Margaret Voss sitting on the fence rail outside the barn, drinking coffee, not talking, just there. She had the sound of a horse breathing in the stall behind her, slow, even, certain. She had, for the first time in 3 years, the sense that the life she was living was genuinely her own, not the hollow negative space left by someone else's absence, but something forward-facing and actual and still becoming. On the day the legal challenge was dropped, Pete Howell published a final article. It was shorter than the others. He wrote that the story had been, on its surface, about a verbal agreement and a horse pedigree. But what he had actually been covering, he wrote, was something harder to put into a headline. The way that acts of genuine care leave a mark on the world that legal documents cannot undo and powerful men cannot calculate away. He wrote that he had been covering rural Kentucky for 2 decades and had not, until that Thursday morning on Route 9, seen a horse walk 5 miles of its own while beside a woman who had given it her last clean water and her old straw hat. He wrote that he was not sure he knew what to make of that, theologically or otherwise. He wrote, but it was one of the most honest things I have ever photographed. The last evening of that week, Clara sat on the fence rail of Roger Patton's paddock and watched Zephyr's Echo move. He was not running. He was not performing. He was simply moving across the late afternoon grass in that specific, purposeful way of horses who are in a space they have decided to trust. That unhurried exploration that is the equine equivalent of settling in. The light was doing the thing it does in Kentucky in the late August evening, going gold, and then amber, and then something that is technically still light, but feels more like warmth made visible. The cicadas had started their nightly shift, and somewhere far to the east a hound was carrying on about something with the full-throated enthusiasm of an animal with no sense of proportion. She watched the horse. She thought about what she had spent 3 years believing, that leaving was a kind of loyalty, that shrinking her life to a manageable size was a tribute to the enormity of what she had lost, that if she did not try, she could not fail what Eli had built. She had been wrong about that. She understood it now not as a revelation, but as something she had known all along and refused to look at directly. The way you know, on some level, that the horse on the side of the road is not just any horse. The way you know, when a sound comes out of a creature on a gravel shoulder in August heat, that it is not just a sound. Zephyr's Echo turned from the far end of the paddock and looked at her across the grass. She looked back. Neither of them moved for a moment. The woman on the fence and the horse at the end of the paddock, regarding each other in the amber light of a Kentucky evening. Then he walked toward her, not running, not urgent, just that steady, deliberate approach of an animal that has somewhere to be and knows it. He stopped at the fence and put his muzzle against her hand. She said, "I know." She said it the way you say something when no translation is required, when the meaning lives in the saying of it and the hearing of it and the space between, which is the only space where certain things can be true at the same time. She said, "I know." And the cicadas kept going in the dark green grass, and the light kept doing what August light does in the evening in Kentucky, and the horse stood at the fence with his chin in her hand, and Clara Vance, widow, 58 years old, on the far side of loss and on the near side of whatever came next, sat on a fence rail in Roger Patton's paddock and let herself be present in her own life, which was, she thought, probably what Eli had been waiting for all along. If you made it to the end of this story, you already know what it is really about. It is not about a horse. It is about what happens when you stop running from the parts of yourself that still know how to love something. Clara did not walk 5 miles on Route 9 because she was brave. She walked because a horse with her husband's eyes made a sound that she recognized, and turning away from that sound was simply no longer possible. We all have something like that waiting on the side of the road. Something that has been carrying our name in its memory long after we believed we stopped being worth carrying. If this story reached you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Leave a comment with where you are watching from, the town, the city, the back porch. Tell us what you thought about in these last few minutes. And if you have not subscribed yet, this is the story that earns the button. There are more stories like this one waiting to be told. Come back for them.